Good afternoon or good evening, everybody, wherever you're coming from, or good morning. We'll get getting started in about 1 or 2 minutes. Welcome to folks who are joining. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Hello, everyone. We'll be getting started in just about 30 seconds. Thank you for coming. All right, I think I'm going to get the ball rolling. Uh, Welcome to Love Methods Week as a companion to Love Data Week. We are happy to be here. We're happy to giving an overview of pre-registration essentials, what pre-registration is, why it matters, and how to do it. Joining me today are myself. I'm David Meller, Senior Policy Analyst here at the Center for Open Science. Um, and joining me is Noah, Mark, and Crystal. Will be giving in-depth explanations about what pre-registration is, how the platform on the registry, on the OSF registry works to create your pre-registration. And Crystal will be giving an overview, wrapping up on a lot of the details and frequently asked questions that we run into. To get the ball started, let me think. Is there any other logistics? Please use the Q&A feature. If Amanda will be monitoring that, if there's anything that's clarifying or technically mistaken, we'll clarify that in the moment. Otherwise, we'll handle the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. That's probably all, and let's get going. So I'd like to start with just a basic definition of what pre-registration is. Um, we see it as, and what it is, it's a time-stamped and it's a read-only version uh, of a study design that's going to occur hosted in a public registry. Now there are a couple of asterisks there. Um, Most registries do allow for updates to plans, and that is essential in order to add transparency and clarity to the entire research process and to give context for when and why those changes might have occurred throughout the course of the study. And then next is that many registries, OSF included, allows for a private embargo period. In the case of the OSF, it's a maximum of 4 years. There are similar terms that are used in different fields just because of the history of when these started and a little bit of disambiguation. For the sake of simplicity, a study registration is the same as a pre-registration. The pre, of course, emphasizes that it was submitted to the registry before the study was conducted. And there are some instances in which a study is registered retrospectively. That's not considered best practice, and we don't encourage that, though there are sometimes that does sometimes occur for some reasons. And finally, in economics, sometimes the term pre-analysis plan is used. um, more frequently than the term pre-registration or registration. For the sake of simplicity, we can assume that all these terms are essentially identical. Overview of a little bit of the history of why it started, and where it stands right now. Uh, One of the biggest originators of study registration was legislation in the year 2000, and it was to solve a very specific problem that the government was funding a large number of studies, in this case, new drugs and biological materials and treatments to emerging or difficult to cure diseases. And it was unclear how patients could find those ongoing clinical trials. So the clinicaltrials.gov was established from the legislation in order to help that specific case of understanding how many ongoing studies are taking place. In addition to the problem of helping understand how many research studies are taking place at any given time, that's not only relevant, it's most relevant, of course, if you're um, a patient looking for a cutting edge treatment, but it's of interest to uh, many researchers who are want to understand how much research is going in a particular field. In addition to helping that file drawer problem of just being able to discover how many studies are taking place, regardless of how many studies end up getting published, conducting pre-registration in basic preclinical research can help increase transparency into the entire research workflow. It can help address flexibility or decisions made as data are coming in order to help check our biases and make sure that the most rigorous hypothesis testing research is taking place if that hypothesis testing is a goal or a method that you've selected for the research. We'll go into more details about a lot of those nuances. So oftentimes we get many questions about how many pre-registrations should be used for some complex studies. In the simplest term, there should be one pre-registration per study, and that's kind of can be an ambiguous term, even though it shouldn't, ideally, it shouldn't be. Um, if a paper has multiple studies in it, multiple pre-registrations can be fine. You simply, as the research evolves and you get ready to start data collection on the next round, put the plan into the registry, conduct the work, analyze as you pre-specified, and keep on going. Um, Another way to think about this is to try to keep a pre-registration tied to an effort to access or generate new data. Even if that data collection effort is going to result in in many different papers, you can assert that the data collection is about to start and that you plan on analyzing it in these different ways that might result in several different papers. And you can certainly change your mind throughout the process and document those changes as the realities of the research come through. Um, the goal of that is to create clarity and transparency into a process that is incredibly complex. And so, as that complex reality uh, starts facing you, update the research plan, and as multiple papers begun generating, you can link back to the original registration that was tied to that first data collection effort. We currently have 11 templates for different research types on the OSF registry. A template helps make sure that you have included sufficient detail for the purposes of the study that you're going to pre-register. And there are trade-offs from some of them. Some of them are very specific to a methodology or a discipline. Some of them will make trade-offs between uh, being more concise for the sake of getting a pre-registration up and going. Some will be more thorough for the purposes of identifying all of the potential decisions that you might be making with the coming study. And so let me give an example of a couple of those to give you an overview of how you would make the decision of which one to pick. And that's one of the most frequently asked questions we get. So these 5 templates are some of the most frequently used templates on the OSF registry. The default one is the OSF pre-registration. It's it's quite thorough. It's designed for many different research types. It can be adapted to different methodologies using existing or non existing data yet that you're about to collect. It could be used for longitudinal studies. It could be used for many different types because the questions will help you articulate where your study fits into the complex array of many different research types. But with that generality, it might not be perfect for any one particular study. So if you are about to conduct research that fits better into any of the other formats, you should definitely use those. And I'll get to those 3 at the end. But the next one is the template from aspredicted.org. Aspredicted.org is a website that promotes the particular set of questions that are designed to contain just enough information to meet common standards for what you see in journals. And if you see expectations from funders or other entities, that one should be sufficient. But it is designed to be as concise as possible to meet those expectations. The next 3 are for different research methodologies. The generalized systematic review, of course, is for systematic reviews. And the reason it's emphasized that it's generalized is that it can be used for many different fields as compared to the systematic reviews that are frequently seen in medical or health research. So this one is, there's an expectation that it can be used across many different disciplines. Secondary data is the template to use when you're about to access an existing data set, and it asks for more detail about what the data set is, how you're going to access it, and importantly, how you're what information you have about any trends in that data set that might influence your decisions about how to analyze it. So use that one if appropriate. And finally, there's a great template for qualitative or mixed methods research, and that was developed I think about 4 or 5 years ago now, and it's seen tremendous uptake again in those disciplines. There'll be 2 different times where you could be asked to select one of those templates. I just wanted to give you a basic screenshot of when you might be asked to select one of these different templates. Again, OSF pre-registration is the default. It's probably appropriate for almost any type of research, but if you know yours fits into one of the other categories, go ahead and select the one that's more appropriate. Now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Noah, who's going to talk next. Noah?
Hello, everybody. How's it going? We're going to talk a little bit about why one might pre-register a project. There's actually a lot of more reasons to pre-register than people might think about. But to get there, we do have to talk a little bit about theory and information and studies and all of that stuff. So next slide, please. So we often think about the research process as having sort of a very clear beginning and an end. We see this thing, we see a result. People with X were found to be Y times more likely to have Z with some significance, blah, 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 et cetera, right? And usually we only see that at the time, we're at the end of that path, right? And we assume that, we have a question and we have a specific set of methods and we have all of these sorts of things and a straight line towards our result. The reality, next slide, is quite a bit more complicated in a lot of cases, because what we're not seeing is all of those other potential places that things could have gone, right? Different methods, different ways of reporting things, different outcomes, the sort of choice of models, what, specific things we're controlled for and whatnot. Things even just like how we we frame a question, and that's even just assuming that the question at the bottom is one single question. We could have been doing all sorts of things here. It's a much more complicated environment. And it's not clear without more information whether or not all of those other options had been explored and we're only seeing the one. All sorts of things might be happening here, or maybe if there was better options out on different branches, or who knows. Research is very, very complicated. So next slide, please. So there's an idea that we have kind of two things that are really important often in science. There's many more than two, but we have two opposing, maybe in some ways kind of opposing ideas: exploration versus confirmation. So when we are exploring something, this is sort of a data-driven approach. We're looking through and we're trying to find interesting stuff out of what our sort of existing data might tell us. It's sort of discovery oriented. It might be something along the lines of the first person looking through a microscope at a thing that's never been looked at before. That's exploration. We don't have a theory behind that. We're just seeing sort of what happens. Often this kind of research might be called hypothesis generating. These terms are kind of loose, so we can have all kinds of ways of thinking about that. That's opposed to confirmatory research, which often we think of as hypothesis driven. We start with a very clear hypothesis. We say, does this does X cause Y? And then this is kind of a necessary thing for thinking about at least frequentist hypothesis testing. There's all kinds of other things in here. When you're thinking about a p-value, it is assumed typically that we are doing confirmatory research, that we are starting from a one question and following sort of a straight and narrow. If that's not true, then there's often ways that we can deal with that statistically, but that's kind of a violation of our basic statistical reasoning in a lot of cases. Generally, we think of confirmatory research as being sort of the highest standard for rigorous evaluation, right? Almost all late stage clinical trials we would think of as confirmatory research. We want to have very high standards for those. And generally as having much more direct decision impact. Next slide, please. So going back to that, people with X were found to be Y times more likely to have Z. What are we actually seeing here, right? We see this result, we see this abstract, but where did it actually come from? What's the process behind it? Was this planned? Was it just going to be that one pathway the whole time? Were other things explored? Maybe we might have been doing some questionable research practices here, like fishing for statistical significance, p-hacking, creating our hypothesis after we already have the result, but kind of saying that we had the hypothesis first. That's often called harking. And what do we actually do with with these results if we don't know the process behind them? It's hard for us to sort of trust and understand the context for these sorts of things if we don't have some additional data showing us that initial process. Next slide, please. So that's nice. That's great for a research consumer. It's always better to have, the more information about the process. But as a producer, there's all kinds of ways that this could potentially help us. So if I'm making research, I very often pre-register things for all sorts of reasons. Now, often we talk about things in terms of preventing p-hacking and all of that stuff. There's actually like a giant number of other things that I think in most cases are going to be much more obviously helpful. So one of them is just making enhanced planning. So when we are going about collecting, before we collect data, before we do anything else, we want to have an idea of how we're analyzing it. And that actually can help us make a much better idea of how we should be collecting the data in the first place. So if we have this view of the entire thing, that can help prevent us from making a lot of errors. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have gotten to the end of the study and said, I wish I had done this differently, that I would have caught had I had a more comprehensive planning. It also enables a lot of feedback. So feedback is most valuable at early stages when you can change things, right? When you can actually go about collecting data differently, doing the analysis differently, rather than retroactively. It also produces a little bit of clarity on what it is that's actually being critiqued. Often in, say, peer review, it's not clear if the reviewer is critiquing the methods, or are they critiquing the results, or who knows. in the case of a pre-registration, it helps enable sort of a little bit of a more focused kind of critique on, say, the methods or anything like that. So we can kind of eliminate the results side of things mostly. It's often talked about as being as enhancing credibility, and yes, it can very much enhance the credibility of things. So, particularly for confirmatory tests, if we pre-registered and we said, okay, this is the path that we are sticking towards, and it is known that that is the case, that can enhance credibility, but it is not inherently true. This is really important. Credibility is a comprehensive idea. Pre-registration can maybe help. It can help a little bit, but the lack thereof doesn't mean it's a bad study, and the fact that there's a pre-registration doesn't mean it's a good study. There's a lot of things that go into that. And of course, research protection. So there's this idea often people talk about with pre-registration that people don't want to do it because it sort of if you show people what you're doing, maybe somebody will run in and scoop it, right? They'll get in first, they'll collect the data, they'll get that first publication, and maybe that might happen sometimes. We don't really have very good evidence suggesting what actually whether scooping like that is sort of a large concern or not. It's not clear, but in a lot of cases, it also serves as kind of an anti-scoop. So I have put down on paper, I've made it known I am doing this research, and you've kind of staked a little bit of a claim there, right? That can help in a lot of cases. So it also helps record what you have done. If you've done all this planning, you're about to collect data, you're doing a whole lot of work, and say your funding is cut off for some reason, or your study is canceled, or something along those lines. If you don't have a record of all the things that you have done and what you've pre-registered, that can be lost, and that's a bit of a problem. And then finally, the thing that most people talk about for pre-registration is limiting temptation for questionable research practices. It says, I have this plan. This is what I intend to do. And it helps you sort of, you've charted this path. It helps you stick to it. Next slide, please. Great. Next slide. Yeah, so all of these other options, you can think about all of those other options, but you have pre-decided we are going to take this one, and we have shown that we're going to take this one. Now, of course, there are many deviations possible of that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. It is not a prison. You do not have to stick to the one path, but we'll get there. Next slide. And of course, there's not just one way of doing pre-registration. Often we talk about pre-registration as being sort of more on the confirmatory end of things, that we pre-register to make sure we sort of, to stick to that straight and narrow to prevent p-hacking, all of that stuff. But there's no reason that's inherently true. We can pre-register extremely exploratory work too, and extremely confirmatory, or highly pre-specified, as it's kind of described here. It is a spectrum. I can tell you that in the same project, I have a pre-registration that says we are simply exploring this space. None of these results should be taken as confirmatory data. It is at the extreme other end. And then at the extreme opposite end, we have actually written code that is with sentences that will belong in our in whatever we publish out of it ahead of time. So it's basically our manuscript is pre-written based on code effectively. So it's at the extreme opposite end of things. And there's everything in between. You can do all sorts of stuff with this. There's a lot of room for thinking about these things and doing it. And with that, I will pass it on to, I think, Mark. Is that right?
All right, Mark, I'm going to stop
Yep.
sharing and give you the platform.
It sounds good. So you got a lot of the why. So I'm going to show you the how. So we're going to go through a kind of a registration workflow in general. I'm going to keep it really high level. So I'm going to share a screen. If you are a OSF user, this is the first thing you will see. You will see your dashboard with all your projects. So how exactly do you start a registration? Some people will go into a project and go to what is called a registration tab and start there. But what if you're new and you have to start a project? You just want to start with the registration. That's the workflow I'm going to start with. To get there, what you would do is you'll click this drop down, click registries. And if you're curious about registrations, it's an opportunity to explore so you can see exactly what other people in your community has entered so you know what that sense of rigor is. But if you want to go ahead and create a registration, you're going to click Add New. You can choose whether you have a project, and you can select your project or not. And you can choose one of these pre-registrations. So you'll select it, and you'll click Create Draft. Now, when you click Create Draft, you'll get something like this. I'm not going to make you guys sit through me actually enter a pre-registration because that can take a bit of time. So I went ahead and pre-populated this for us. The first thing you're going to see is the Metadata tab. The Metadata tab has a lot of required information. This is to, one, share that information with others, because what's going to happen is that's how other search algorithms, such as our own personal OSF, will search for it. So that's how we can filter by license, subjects, etc., things that you put in. But it's how other search engines, such as Google and Google Scholar, will be able to find your registration, your studies. Each template is going to be a little bit different in that different questions it's going to ask you. I'm using the OSF pre-registration template, which is our most thorough and rigorous. And you'll be asked a series of questions. Some of these will be text fields. Some of them will be radio buttons. Some of them will be multiple choice. And then some of them will also give you the option to upload files. So you can click here, click the upload file, or if you have a project associated with it, this one I didn't, but if you did have one, you'll see some of those files listed right here, which you just click it and it'll tag up here and it'll connect it to that question. So you can go through these and pretty much click next all the way through. Another alternative that you can do is we do have help guides to kind of help with this. David posted that earlier within the slideshow, but I'm pretty sure I can put that in the chat once I am done. Essentially what it will do is it'll take you to a list of all available templates. Within that is a Google Doc. Just duplicate that to Google Doc and you have all the questions right there. So that way you can collaborate with others, whether or not they are on OSF or not. That being said, what happens when we're all the way done? When we're all the way done and all the required fields are completed, you'll know if it's required by this red asterisk. But once everything's completed, you'll get this review page. This gives you another opportunity to go through it, review it, make sure everything is correct, everything is accurate. And if it is, you'll click register. When you click register, you'll get a few additional questions, such as, do you want to make this public immediately, which means anyone in the world can review it? Or do you want to make it embargoed? Embargoed is just a fancy word. It says it's private, but it can only be private up to 4 years. And so you can click here and choose the date. So you can go through the month, and then you can change the year. I'm very much an advocate of open science. I would say make public immediately. So when you click this, what you'll get is an archiving page. The archiving page is telling you a couple of key things. One, it's telling you that do not interact with any files that may be linked to your registration, because the system is going to try to archive that in about 48 hours. Because the rest of your contributors, if they have administrative permissions, have 48 hours to review and reject it if it needs additional edits. It's also going to tell you that you were just sent an email to your email box, which I probably have one in my email right now, asking me to also review it just as a double check and to either accept that submission or reject that submission. And you can see that by this pending approval up here. It's waiting for everyone to go through their emails and approve or disapprove. Again, note, this is only for those that were set up with administrative permissions. Those with write permissions or read permissions do get an email, but it's just to inform them. They don't have that decision-making capabilities. So that's the workflow. And this is kind of what the registration looks like. I'm actually going to go right over here so I can see that it is actually public. Here's all the information that we have entered. And here's the metadata that we actually put in as well. So this is kind of the key information. Some of the things that we get is how can I make sure that all my information is protected? One is by like license. Two, date registered. So if it ever does come up that you're concerned that someone kind of took your idea, which I know is a shared concern, but we have never experienced that here on the OSF. I know it's just kind of a sense of caution in everyone's minds. But this is how you can argue it, saying here was the license that I had with mine. So that way I can say what people can do with it, as well as the date that was registered, so that way you kind of have that claim to that idea. We also have a lot more metadata that we're expanding. And again, this is just to make it easier for search algorithms to find your information. So you can include things such as resource information, funding, etc. I mentioned files. If you connected any files, right now this is empty, all those would be populated right here. Currently, anytime you have files within a project, all that will be automatically archived for you, which means everything will be there, it'll be persistent, it'll be permanent. Resources. This is a way for us to connect additional information, such as files and documents that are not on OSF. So let's say that you're doing EEG and you have, I don't know, let's say 50 gigabytes worth of information. And we can't really put it on OSF because the file limit is 5 gigabytes. We do have that limitation. So you decide to store it elsewhere, or you decide to store it elsewhere because of IRB requirements. As long as you get a DOI, you can still link it here. So that way people can just go to your registration and outsource to all the different types of connections to help find all those resources. That way they can see exactly what you did, what you found out, how did you resolve challenges, etc. And then a couple of things I'm just going to highlight very high level is analytics. So you can see exactly who's seeing your registration, etc. So I have like my analytics here. And then lastly, I'm going to go with updates. So registrations should be a plan, but it should not be a prison. What that means is things change. We're not psychic. We cannot predict the future. So we need a way so that way we can update our registrations and inform how things have changed, how you encountered challenges, how you embrace those challenges, and how you overcome them to tell your entire story. It helps goes to your critical thinking as well. And the way we do that is through an update. To do an update, you'll click this, start update. We're going to click next. And essentially what it'll do is it'll track exactly which questions you've changed once you submit it. It also requires that you put in a justification. What changed? Why did it need to be changed? So that way people such as journal editors or funders who are reviewing your documentation, they have all that information in there. And the platform is actually going to track each and individual update. Right now we had original, but it'll have like original, update 1, update 2, update 3, all the way as many as you need, and then I'll have the latest one. So I will pause there and I will pass it on to Crystal.
Take over the screen here and share the slides. And Crystal, take it
All
away.
right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about some common challenges and some potential solutions. One is kind of just to reiterate what Mark was saying about updating pre-registrations. There are a lot of things that could change between the time that you pre-register and the time that you are doing your analyses. For instance, maybe you notice that there's an error or a typo in your pre-registration. Maybe you forgot a 0 in the number of samples that you needed. You can go and you can make updates that way. You may also, perhaps through looking through the literature or anything like that, decide that maybe there's some additional analyses that you'd like to add, or you learn about a data analysis strategy that is actually more appropriate for the data that you're going to be working with, and you've been convinced perhaps by a new paper that's come out. Or you just realize that you have to make adjustments to your design, right? Something has happened. Maybe you've gained or lost some funding, or there's a pandemic, right? There's a lot that could definitely happen where you may need to change the way in which you're collecting your data. And so you can actually update your pre-registration to account for this. There are 3 ways that you can update your pre-registration. Mark has shown one. If we go to the next slide, you can, when you're on your My Registration page on the OSF registries, at each of your submitted registrations, there is a button that you can click in without actually having to go in. On the next slide, it should show also if you are on the projects, if you are actually in your OSF project, there is a registrations tab up there at the top. You can also update from there. And then on the next slide, that is the one that Mark showed. If you go to next, where Mark showed there that you can update, and you can also see, as he mentioned, that you can have multiple updates for a pre-registration. So you do always have that option of updating, of just making sure that you're talking about the changes that happen to your research as it moves on. And so on the next challenge is that maybe there's not a template for the kind of research that you are doing. This is okay. We've kind of briefly alluded to this, but just to make it explicit, there are a couple of different solutions for this. Next slide. The first is that you can use the open-ended registration template, which is a box and allows you to put in a summary, and then you can also upload a file that you can just make your own document, list out the details that you have for your study, and then add it that way. Next slide. You can also use that is actually what that ends up looking like, sorry. So you can see there's a box there that just you can provide a narrative summary, and then you can upload files that you need that you can attach to it. That's probably going to be your best shot. You can also sometimes, for instance, if you're doing mixed methods research, you may actually pull from different templates. So we do have like Google Doc and Word document versions of our templates. So you can actually pull questions from different templates. If you like how some templates have certain questions worded, but not others, you can kind of pull from there and put that into your own combined document and then upload that way. Another common challenge that we often hear from folks is how do I convince my collaborators or my PI to engage in pre-registration? You know, what if they don't want to pre-register? Or how do I get collaborators on board? And we have a couple of different solutions for that. One of the ones that I often start with is just having discussions. So if we go to the next slide, I always start with just listening to what questions people have and what concerns they might have first. Sometimes it's not that people are against pre-registering specifically, but they just have questions. Maybe they've never done it before. Maybe they've heard conflicting things from different people about the uses of pre-registration. Maybe there are some myths that need to be busted. For instance, that you can't change your design after you've pre-registered. And so really listening to the kinds of things that are going to be like important to them is going to be helpful. And then I try to connect those questions and concerns to values that they might have. So if somebody says, you know, I don't want this to slow down my research. I want to be able to get this publication out faster. I often talk about my own experience. Actually, was just in a session right before this where I was talking about reproducibility, and I talked about pre-registration has actually sped up my research process because a lot of times throughout the research process, you know, the design part is pretty quick and the getting, you know, IRB approval and stuff like that, the data collection. And then we spend a lot of time arguing about analyses and getting into what the writing of the paper is going to end up looking like. People forget what the initial hypotheses were, or people argue about what variables should be going into the analyses or whether we should be transforming variables and all of this stuff. But when you have those conversations earlier on in the process and you hammer those down before you've done the analyses, that tends to make those conversations less fraught in my experience. And then once I actually have the data collected, the writing of the paper, the writing part is actually a lot easier and a lot faster. That's what it's been in my experience. So if efficiency is it, then you know you can appeal to, well, you're not going to be running 800 different analyses because you've already got your analysis plan. If you do need to change it for, you know, a good reason, you can do that. So make sure that you connect any questions or concerns that they have to the values that they have, to the things that are important to them. And then how pre-registration can help with it. Pre-registration is not a cure-all. It doesn't fix everything in the research process, but it can help to lead to principled discussions about best practices within a particular study. So I think sometimes just talking to people or just asking people, you know, hey, can we just try it out? Can we just try out? Can we start this process? Can we go through one of the templates together and try to answer the questions together and just see how that works for us and how that feels for us? And sometimes that's enough. People just kind of need a little bit of help getting started. Next challenge And the last one that we'll talk about today until we get to the Q&A session is, can I pre-register in a different language? So it may be possible that you're more comfortable writing about research in a non-English language. The English is often the language that a lot of scientific work is in. We do have a couple of suggestions for folks that might want to do their pre-registration in a different language. We definitely support them in the OSF, so folks can do it. But some things that may be helpful. One is, if we go to the next slide, is to include English metadata. So one of the things about repositories is that we want things to be discoverable. And since a lot of people do their searching for pre-registrations in English, even if the pre-registration itself is in a different language, it can be helpful to include some of those tags or some of those descriptions in English, maybe include both the language that you're writing in and the English version of it. That can help with discoverability so that people can find it. So especially for tags, it'll be useful to have some English tags in there. You can have the other language, you can have the tags in other languages as well. Totally fine, but maybe having English tags at the very least. And then another set of considerations that you just want to ask yourself, if we go to the next slide, are if your research is funded, what languages does your funder accept? So if your funder is going to be reviewing the pre-registration, will they want it in the language that you are more comfortable writing in, or will they want it in English? You may also consider what languages journals that you might want to submit to, what they accept. And then if you want to register in multiple languages, which sometimes folks like to do, you're going to have to make updates in both languages. So just something to consider. It may be useful just to have one pre-registration, but as opposed to two. So keep it to one, because then you're updating fewer. So I think that leads us into the Q&A portion. So if we can run through some of the questions that have come in during this.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and thanks to my fellow panelists. We've been answering a few of them, but maybe some of those that I've answered will be of interest to others, so we'll go over them. Also, Mehdi left, but their question was relevant, I think. Noah, I'm going to pass this to you. Some of the most important discoveries in biology and medicine were accidental and happened just by following the unexpected data. How does your platform take care of this?
Totally. Yeah. So one of the things I really love about this question is kind of the answer to this is already built into the question, which is in some sense, right? The reason, when we talk about one of these most important discoveries and so on, that were totally accidental, and that is true. The most revolutionary things in science are inherently going to be accidents, because if we already sort of knew what was going to happen, we're testing a hypothesis, we already had an idea. And that is really important. But the great thing about about all of those stories that we all love, we have those stories because somebody said we were doing something else and then we found that thing. So if we pre-register and said we're doing this thing, and then we have a record of saying, now we found this other thing, that only enhances the story in a lot of sense. Now, how does the platform take care of the issue? We talked a lot about how you can do updates and so on, but it really is just there for telling the story of things that can be talked about in a publication, that can be talked about all sorts of ways. There's really no limit to taking care of that. Updates are great for these sorts of things in various ways.
Awesome, thank you.
And if I can
yeah.
add to that, I think also some of where that story comes from may not be in the pre-registration itself, but that may be in the manuscript. So you would still, say like, here are the pre-registered analyses that I did, and here are the results from the pre-registered analyses that we did. We also did these exploratory, or we also found this on accident, or this result came up and it surprised us, so we explored. So like having pre-registered a study or a set of analyses doesn't mean that you can't add other stuff later. It's just about like describing like, here's the stuff that we pre-registered, here's the other stuff that we also did. And so it's not demoting it or anything like that. It's just separating that out so that the audience knows, here's what we plan to do and here's also what came up. So a lot of that description is going to come in the manuscript itself.
Awesome, yeah. Next question. Often people may not have an idea of the specific journal that they plan to submit a manuscript to when they start a project. Does having that public registration cause problems if researchers end up submitting to a journal that does anonymized or blinded peer review? They may like to answer that one.
I can give that one a go. Yeah. So this is really this is a case that I think there is truth to this for sure, right? So there are cases in which a journal may not may not want to publish something that there's already something existing out there, right? It could just be like the fact of pre-registration to that journal means it's not sort of original enough, or in some cases you're pointing out that a blinded review can be an issue. What we have found over the years, does exist, this does happen, but the theory of the problem is often dramatically worse than the reality of the problem. This is kind of it will happen differently in different fields for different people, but it's usually not going to be a major issue. What we're actually finding is the more salient one is actually the opposite, where in some cases, editors and so on are actually kind of requiring that you already have a pre-registration in a lot of sense. So there's not a clear, clean thing here. This is ever evolving for how editors are dealing with these things, but in general, in sort of a general sense and not a specific sense, we've found that this has not been a giant roadblock in the future. You don't usually shoot yourself in the foot by pre-registering.
If I can also add to that, one thing that us in the product team, because we're typically interacting with users with a similar problem, you can embargo your registration, which makes it private, and you can create an anonymized view only link, which means that in that metadata that I showed, it does not show your names. Now, if you put it into one of the responses or files, we cannot anonymize that, but that is the way you can do blind peer review. That said, if you ever make your registration public, that gets a little bit more finicky. And once it's made public, we do not make it embargoed again because that goes against the nature of open science. So there is that feature, just something to think about what could happen. So embargo might be an option for you.
Yeah, so I would also note one other thing too with embargoes. So you can always embargo something and you can bring it public sooner. So if in your field it is a norm to have anonymized or mass review, and you know that that's going to be an issue, in probably a good portion of the journals that you'd submit to, you can embargo it. You can use the anonymized links that Mark's talking about, and then whenever you're ready, say it gets published. You can if your embargo date has not hit yet, you can always make it public before then. So you're not that embargo date is like that's like the last date that it can be private. You can always bring it to be public sooner than that.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. All right. Here's a good question. Anna asks, what if after the pre-analysis plan, we run the plan survey, but the experiment was not done correctly? Can I update this saying that we will run another survey? The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is that you might want to consider reporting that one um, as incompleted. So this data collection effort did not lead to usable information. And then create another pre-registration that's dated close to when you plan on starting the next round of data. So it's a little bit up to you, but in the spirit of one pre-registration per one data collection effort, even if that data collection effort doesn't result in a paper, you can report that it was done inconclusively. The data are not usable for whatever reason. And the next study is going to use the same methods or use the same survey or fix the issues that we learned from that one. That latter suggestion is a little bit preferred in order to keep an accurate record of how much research is attempted every year, even if that doesn't correspond to how much research ends up getting published every year. That would be my recommendation. Does anybody else have a different opinion or anything to add about that? Let me think. All right, Justin asks, how have universities made it easier to do pre-registration? In initial surveys that go to the research department, do they align their survey with OSF so that it can be copy pasted?
I can probably take this one because we do
Mark,
sometimes get emails. So I also help with our support center, and we get emails like this all the time where they're saying, I'm a professor, I want them to start pre-registering their work, but I know that pre-registration is permanent. So can I get them to start practicing this? And the answer, and I promised you guys I was gonna put this in the chat when I was doing my little demo, is I just put in chat now, is we have help guides that have linked to Google Docs. I'm gonna share a screen real quick, just as a reference. But these are all the different types of Google Docs. So for example, for OSF pre-registration, oops, I'm doing that one. You can click on this. It will show you a quick little template of all the different questions that template will ask. That way they can kind of get a feel about what to expect. And it's also a way for you as an instructor to see what they might expect from these different types of templates on OSF to start getting them building up those habits. Now you can write on this specifically and you can request it. What you'll have to do is go to File, Make Copy, and then it can go on from there. So that is an alternative that other instructors have used when they contact with us through support. Hope that answered that question.
And if the question's referring to like IRBs and stuff, IRBs and pre-registrations ask similar questions, but they're usually not exactly the same. So sometimes you can use some of the same information across, but pre-registrations don't explicitly refer to like ethics of stuff. And IRBs, at least in theory, generally don't focus a lot on like specifics around analyses or, you know, methodological issues. Although some IRBs do include some kind of high-level discussions of methods whenever they're asking for information about that. So at least in terms of like the match between like IRBs and pre-registrations, there's some stuff that you can use, I think, across whatever forms your university has and pre-registration. And ethics forms are not usually made public, although a researcher may choose to make those public. But they're not asking exactly the same questions. So there may be less overlap there than expected.
next, what is the advantage to pre-register here on OSF compared to Prospero or rct.gov.us for randomized controlled trials? I think, Noah, you said you wanted to take a shot at
Sure,
that?
yeah. So, okay, so OSF is definitely, the best way to think about this is it's not really an advantage or a disadvantage. Often these are registries that serve very different purposes for very different things. So clinicaltrials.gov, for example, is a mandated registration for the existence of any clinical trials that involve humans. It is mostly something that is there for searchability. There's not really much that you post on clinicaltrials.gov to talk about your methods. So it is a searchability thing, whereas when we're talking about pre-registration, we're talking about that pre-analysis plan style of thing. So it's a different kind of registry. Prospero is sort of is a use case where it's sort of very focused on things like systematic reviews that has a very specific set of protocols that you follow. You know, this you have to talk about your search terms. They're like very specified things. So it's kind of more of a niche field. There are lots and lots of other registries out there that do different kinds of pre-registration. The one thing, what OSF is basically as close as you can get to sort of a universal pre-register, or as close as we are, not can get, a universal pre-registration system, but it's certainly not the only one. I would encourage you to explore all sorts of things. There's usually stuff in your field or your topic, or legal requirements and so on. And we'd be happy to advise, you know, on other pre-registration services or registration services.
All right. So I'm reviewing these and trying to listen at the same time. Rita asks about using the generalized scoping review template, and asks us after completing that, does the protocol need to be attached also? And Rita, I would say I would encourage you to attach the protocol to that. There's likely some additional details in that protocol that might not have been asked in the template, and if there's a spot to attach the protocol, it's just another way to increase transparency and create an archive of that that document sort of at the start of the study. So I would encourage you to do so, but I can also say that you've met the spirit of pre-registration if you fill that out and end up not attaching the protocol. So it's optional, but I would say encouraged. Sophie asks, this might be a hard question, but please share your thoughts. We'll tackle it, Sophie. When is the best time to register? On the first day of a project, after thinking about the questions for a while, after pilot data has been acquired? I find it hard to know when and how much time it should take to do a pre-registration. Once the project has been going on for a while, it feels hard to pause and pre-register instead of starting data collection, especially if the process will be long. Any thoughts on that? I have some thoughts, but I want to allow others to chime in.
We could maybe jump in here. So this also relates to another question on the timing of things from anonymous attendee. So when is the best time? It depends on what you're talking about, like for what goals you specifically have. But in general, the best time is going to be the point at which you are pretty sure you have a kind of a comprehensive view of the project and as it's going to be, but before you've actually collected data. That will tend to be the thing that gives those nice little the benefits of keeping that sort of straight and narrow, that confirmatory kind of view in there. But that is not necessarily the best time for your particular study, right? It may be the case that you have already gotten to a point because of logistical reasons or something along those lines, and you can in fact pre-register at a much later point for, say, searchability or for anything along those lines. So there's not so much a universal answer, except in general as early as you can. Yeah.
I'll chime in here and get some thoughts. Sophie mentioned pilot data, and that phrase can be used in different ways by different people. The way I recommend thinking about pilot data is you're testing out methods to see if the data collection process is doable, and you might refine your methods based on what you find from the pilot data. And then ideally, to address the issues that we've been talking about, that pilot data would not be used as part of the main analysis of the study that's about to be conducted. It serves its purpose to help refine methods. And after that refinement process takes place, but before the next bit of data is collected, I think that's a golden opportunity to pre-register because you've worked out a lot of kinks. You should have both very precise research questions and very precise data collection processes at that point. And so you've reduced the chances that there are going to be major changes to the research plan at that point. And you don't have to use, you don't necessarily have to disclose or share or talk about the pilot data as if it were existing data for the purpose of the registration. When we ask questions in the templates about, do you have any existing data? It doesn't mean pilot data. It means data that you're going to use for your main analysis. And so you can go ahead and say that data collection has not begun and I don't have any data, as long as you've honestly gotten rid of that pilot data and aren't going to use it further.
I'll add to that just very, very briefly. I have a pre-registration right now that is just for the pilot version of a project, and the pre-registration says we will be throwing out all of these data. The data are gone. You can even pre-register that. Like we'll report it, but it doesn't mean anything, and it's not going to do anything. So you can pre-register even sort of the early pilot phases if you want, and it helps keep you sort of in that plan.
Just looking at any
David, actually, I'm doing a quick time check. I think we have 3 minutes left and we have several more questions. How are we going to address any questions that we don't get to?
Yeah, I'm just looking at them now. We can write those up. There's a couple of complex issues. Let me mention just a couple of things. With AI being used to quickly generate both a registration and then fake data to go along with that, it's a huge and thorny issue that this process isn't designed to address. It goes under the big ugly bucket of fraud that any system can be used and abused in a way. Registration is appropriate for adding clarity to an authentic effort, and it adds a little bit more effort to the process of fraud, so it makes it more deliberate. But it's not going to be a catch-all solution for what ails everything. The registrations can be cited if they're publicly available. It has a DOI and it can be cited as a proposed research study. The Life Cycle Journal Project is another initiative here at the Center for Open Science. I don't have time to give an overview of that, but I think the URL, somebody could put that in the chat, please. I think it's lifecyclejournal.org or something close to that. But it's a cool project where we encourage review of every stage of the research process by different teams who are specializing in that. With that, I would like to thank everybody, my esteemed panel members. I'd like to thank all the participants who took time out of your day to learn about pre-registration. We're here to answer questions, so you can reach out to us if anything else comes along your way. Otherwise, have a great day and have a great week.